morning or good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, All Roads Lead to DevOps with Jean Kim and TJ Randall. And without further ado, today's presenters are TJ Randall, Vice President of Customer Success at ZB Labs, and industry thought leader and author, Jean Kim. And off to you, TJ.
Well, thank you, Amanda.
Great to be here with you, by the way.
Great to be here with you, Jean. So today, the goal for our conversation today is this, is we recognize that there's a lot of different ways in which teams not only start out with this DevOps transformation, but how they kind of navigate through that as an organization. And really the focus for today will be on these large enterprise organizations that are really trying to embrace DevOps and incorporate, not just the tooling, but the people and process into their practices. So we're going to look at some different teams, some different groups from a very high level, and then talk about, some of the features of, what that transformation will look like. So, Jean, how do we know what we're talking about? How do we know, we're being relevant?
So I've been studying high-performance technology organizations for 20 years, and my primary area of passion for the last 6 years now, is I've been studying how large, complex organizations that have been around for decades or even centuries, how they've been adopting DevOps principles and practices. And one of the things that has always amazed me is, as you suggested, how many roads there are to this common journey that we're calling DevOps. And it is amazing to see that, they're coming from every possible background. And so just very briefly, the DevOps Enterprise Summit is a conference for technology leaders to share their experience reports. What industry do they compete in? Tell us about the company. Where do you fit in the org chart? What problem did you solve? What did you do? What were the outcomes? What did you learn and why? What problems still remain? And to date, we now have over 250 case studies of how these organizations have brought in DevOps. And I guess what's been amazing to me is that these are organizations that often have been, these are stories of rebellion where, these rebels are overthrowing very powerful ancient orders. And it doesn't actually matter whether that ancient powerful order is dev, QA, ops, or security. And so as we go through these various paths, I'll be bringing up some of my favorite stories. And we'll both be talking about, like, why would these different functional roles do these things and what's really in it for them. Does that resonate with you, TJ?
Yeah, I think that sounds like a very relevant conversation. And again, even there's going to be people here today listening that are just starting out and they're asking those questions. How do we get started? What should we look for? Okay, let's get in the car and get going. So route one, our development teams. So one of the features that we tend to see around development teams when they start a DevOps transformation, this actually tends, I think, to be a very traditional starting point for teams embracing DevOps. And what's interesting about development, when they do focus on their transformation, they tend to focus on a lot of things that are important for developers, controlling the tools, controlling the process for building their applications, making sure that they're building secure applications in efficient ways. So it really tends to be almost a development-centric way of making sure they're pushing good code through the delivery pipeline. Is that something that you tend to see as part of your conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, right? I mean, it's what's always been amazing to me is that they're all doing it for very selfish reasons, right? Whether it's dev-centric, ops-centric, etc. And so I think the preconceived notion is that many people do kind of attribute DevOps to developers just being so sick and tired of dealing with slow infrastructure and ops groups. And I think that is definitely one of the reasons why dev is often the launching point for DevOps journeys. I think one of the my favorite examples is Alice Rea. She is Vice President of Digital Technologies for Kaiser Permanente. So it's the largest integrated health provider. And initially, it was really focused for improving the development experience. So how can we go from more quickly reduce the time where we can go from features being put into development through testing, through integration, through testing, and eventually through deployment, so it's actually running in production. And that involved a huge modernization of how we do automated testing instead of very slow and tedious manual testing, maybe a rethinking of how integration testing is done, making it more possible for developers to more quickly develop, test, and deploy value independently of each other. So that's certainly one of them. And the fact of doing this in a very heavily regulated environment like healthcare has always been amazing to me. In fact, there was a case study that was presented both by her and in earlier years where they actually did this for the patient and provider portal. So this is actually in some ways the most risky part of the organization, where it has all of the sensitive information, both for clinicians, doctors, and patients.
Wow, that's a significant investment, right? On that, there's a lot of risk there.
Yeah, no, totally. And the fact that they had the bravery, to do this, knowing that it was ultimately the best thing for the organization. That's something common in all of these case studies. The next case study is on the next slide. Yes, Chris Hill, Senior Development Manager, Jaguar Land Rover. So this is another sort of very dev-centric story. So here was a developer who was tired of having to take months to turn code builds around. So this is for the in-car infotainment systems, among other things, and they were having to span multiple different suppliers. So it wasn't just Jaguar Land Rover developers. It was with their component manufacturers, some of it offshore, and often the only way to actually get code builds involved copying things to and from USB drives, to simulators and so forth. So this one I love just because I think it represents a very challenging configuration of supplier relationships and technology, and a story of, again, how a dev leader got so frustrated that he insisted on essentially creating this internal capabilities to enable continuous integration, continuous test, very much against the desires of the other development groups who were just very happy with TWADI, the way we've always done it.
Right.
So I think this, again, is a great example of just the level of the word rebellion, right? Where someone has such conviction that there's a better way to do things, they're willing to take extraordinary risks and ultimately get elevated in the organization. So he was there for, I think, over 6 years, and he's just started a new role at T-Mobile. By the way, do these problem statements sound familiar to you, TJ?
Absolutely. I mean, it's, as you're kind of highlighting, when it's a development transformation, it doesn't mean it's easy just because we're starting in development. They're having to work with their constituents across the organization, and that's a challenge, right? To be able to put yourself out there and say, there's a better way to do this, and some of it is going to involve a lot of change to a lot of existing process. So yeah, this is the stories that we're seeing as well.
Brilliant. And by the way, one last note on Mr. Chris Hill. He was actually offered an opportunity to, so he was working here in Portland, Oregon at one of the development centers, and he was invited to corporate headquarters in the Midlands, where he he decided to move his family to, just because here was an opportunity to elevate the state of the practice for the thousands of developers across the JLR enterprise. So again, just another common trajectory that I think is common to so many of these people who are blazing new trails in DevOps.
Agreed.
Okay, next slide. Yes, Stephanie Gillespie, SVP of Digital Channel Technology, and John Rez, or who we call, that's short for John Rostarski. He's now SVP of Continuous Delivery. So, I bring this one up because I'll bring up John Rez in the context of operations, but he partnered with Stephanie Gillespie because she was in charge of what they called D17, the Digital 17 initiative that was essentially pushed by the board and the CEO to help modernize the user experience to make Key the 12th largest bank, to make them even more competitive in the marketplace. And so it was the findings of the development organization at Key that the old way of working was never going to work, and this spanned mobile, this spanned the e-commerce properties and so forth, that they need a dramatically different way of working. And so John Rez has spoken at DevOps Enterprise for 3 years in a row, and last 2 years ago we had him present with Stephanie Gillespie, just showing how much Rez was able to help the development organizations achieve their goals, and just to see Ms. Gillespie not just acknowledge Rez, but be able to say how dependent they were on the capabilities he was building to make all their development productive. That was just such a treat, and just to see all the things that they were able to do together to win in the marketplace. That was delightful beyond words. So I know that you've probably spent a lot of time with the key team, the key.
That's right. And one of the things, the features that you called out there was, it's interesting where, I sometimes think about it back in my IT experience, where the executive teams and the board of directors weren't talking about how developers develop and deliver code. And it really speaks to how important this DevOps thing really is, right? This is transformational for businesses in order to compete and succeed. So it's a phenomenal story at KeyBank where you have the support of the executive teams, the development teams then feel empowered to make those changes, which are, they're challenging.
Absolutely. Let's skip the next slide with Scott Prue. I'll be mentioning him in a different context.
Okay.
But I think on the next slide with the lead time, if you build that out, essentially the problem for development is this: is that in the ideal, we want single piece flow, right? The developer can, write code. They can commit it into version control. It can be, the test can be automatically run. It can be, in the ideal, pushed to some sort of production-like environment, whether it's production or some sort of UAT environment, and that should happen within minutes, worst case hours. And in the reality, right, for so many organizations, especially these very successful organizations that were the first into technology, they're stuck in this world where it still takes weeks, months, or quarters. And so, what DevOps can enable is really shortening that so that we can achieve that in minutes, not hours. And this brings joy to developers, right? You can't get a sense of flow or focus. You can't learn anything if you never see the outcomes of your own work. So, I think that's what's really in it for development. So on the next slide, I think I try to punctuate that by describing what those are, right? So yes, liberate development from maybe slower ops and infrastructure groups. Enables developer productivity, not just individual productivity, but enable teams to work independent of other teams so that they can do things without having to communicate and coordinate with potentially 20, 30 different other dev teams. And by doing that, that's what allows us to scale developer productivity linearly. Just to end that, actually, any comments on that, TJ?
No, absolutely. And I think, getting to the point where development teams can deliver smaller changes faster actually helps everyone in the delivery pipeline, whether you're the QA team that has to test those changes, whether you're the marketing team that has to advertise those changes. It's easier for everybody, really, right? It makes it faster as well as more consumable.
By the way, TJ, it's like one of the things that kind of delight me, and in sort of a bad way, right? Is that when we have if everything has to be tested together, that means that and deployed together. This is terrible, right? It's like if you have 20 groups of HAL have to sort of do their own part, and then one group screws it up, then you probably have to unwind everything, and now no one can release.
Right, exactly. So you, instead of getting 20 changes, you get like one that's at least it's something. So
or zero.
Or zero, right?
Which makes it even worse. Okay, so just to sum up, I'm going to be showing this slide a bunch of times. I highlighted in green the ones where I would say, it's probably a gross oversimplification, but these are the ones that I think were really primarily driven by a dev leader, where it was really dev was the source of energy. Oh, and by the way, I think the thing that is worth noting is that it's not all green, right? Is that it is only one of the routes to get to greatness as we know is possible in the DevOps community.
Absolutely. Okay. Let's move on to the next route, which is this architecture team. So, again, we're talking about these kind of big kind of concepts, right? But generally in a large enterprise organization, they employ this type of strategy to say, let's have an architecture team And these tend to be kind of what people think of as almost like the thought leaders in the organization, where when they visualize a solution, they're looking almost across the entire organization. So not necessarily by application team or technology, but they're really trying to solve the problem, organically as well as across that organization. And one destination, this is actually becoming more and more the norm that we run across, which is the solution that the architecture teams are building is really DevOps as a service, meaning you're now providing a self-service way for teams to onboard not just the tools, but also the processes, get people involved. And this service has, new concepts, like there's SLAs assigned. It has to be up and running all the time. Like you'll have a small team managing the tools in the service. So do you find that, Gene, across your research about this type of approach from the architecture teams?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sorry, I have to sort of make my obligatory architecture joke. Back when I was at Tripwire I was there for 13 years, from 97 to 2010, and we were always trained that it was okay to ignore architects, especially chief architects. And I think it was the joke we would make is that these are the people who lived in their ivory tower. They come out once a year. They email everybody their Visio diagram and a PowerPoint slide, and they go back to their ivory tower, never to be seen again for another year. Yep. And I think that was just kind of a snide way of saying they didn't really influence how daily work is performed. However, right, but that was probably never true. But if that were true, right, it's certainly not true now. In fact, I would say it's actually, if you take a look at who is driving DevOps in large complex organizations, it's often the architects. So this is Dr. Topo Palm, the first technical fellow at Capital One, now one of 50. I'll be mentioning him in the security context, but he's really part of an architecture group that's trying to drive more standardized ways of working. This is not the old way of standardizing where everyone's forced to use a terrible tool chain that makes you feel sorry for them, but they're trying to make it so that every team can actually benefit from the greatness that's being created elsewhere in the organization. And so he actually presented with a former director of IT audit. She's now technology governance director. But this is all about, in fact, I guess, the goal of architecture, right, is to help be able to share learnings and share greatness. So he is proudly an architect that is, but although he probably self-identifies more as a developer. Another great example is Walmart. Oops. So again, a dev manager, but I think he is at heart an architect. He spoke last year, and he talked about at DevOps Enterprise, and he spoke about how they're adopting functional programming, that they're trying to move away from so much state being being contained inside of the different areas of the code. And he talked about how at Jet.com and now at Walmart, how they used Kafka and F# functional programming techniques across not just inventory management, but fulfillment, order entry, basically the entire supply chain. And now he's being tasked with doing the same thing for across the entire Walmart enterprise and reduce the number of inventory management systems from 3 down to 1. So just an amazing example of how I think the clarity of thinking that comes from the architectural point of view is really being realized, very much in the code as opposed to just in the Visio diagrams.
Sure.
And then the last one I'll mention specifically is our friend Scott Prue at CSG.
Oh, I think I got him in first. Let me go.
Yeah, sorry about that.
All right, no, that's my bad.
So he he self-identifies as an architect, as a chief architect, but over the years he's been promoted from chief architect to VP of development to SVP of product development and product operations. And yes, he knows all the keyboard accelerators in Visio, but here's a person who has been elevated through the organization, now owning the majority of the technology value stream, and doing this at the largest bill printing company in the U.S. And the genesis of this operation, and their customers are like Comcast, Charter Communications, or TV, right? If you get a paper monthly statement from one of those, right, it comes from CSG. And so the genesis of that app is an application that was built at First Data 45 years ago, and just to see how they've modernized their technology practices, how they're growing in a shrinking market. I mean, it's just amazing. And I'll just maybe note that this is what makes studying the DevOps enterprise community so fun, is that this is a group of people who are not only making a huge material improvement to their organization, but they're being promoted just because demonstrating that everyone appreciates what they're doing, because they know that they have the best long-term interests of the organization at heart. So any comments on those case studies so far?
I mean, besides their obviously amazing stories, I think you said it best, where the architects, when they're doing this right, they're providing the tools and the processes that people want to use, right? I think that's a great way to think about it, because you're exactly right. Instead of being this profile where they come down and they wave a wand and it's Visio and they step away, they understand the needs of the organization, and they're able to say, hey, let me take that knowledge and deliver in terms of accelerating growth. And you highlighted another nice point, which is it helps the architects themselves in terms of their career growth, in terms of how they want to grow and learn as well, right? That's why we're all in this. So I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you can go to slide, architecture enables teams too, right? It's not, to your point, right? They understand the needs of the organization as well as the needs of the development teams and the developer themselves. And so this is a finding that really substantiates that. This came out in the 2017 State of DevOps report. So this is the work that I've been doing with Dr. Nicole Forsgren and Jez Humble. This now spans over 6 years of research, 30,000 respondents. And what we found was that architecture is one of the biggest predictors of performance, as measured by to what extent can teams make large-scale changes to their parts of the system without the permission of anyone outside their team. To what extent can they complete their work without having to do a lot of fine-grained communication and coordination with people outside their team? Can they deploy and release their products or services on demand, independent of even services they may depend upon? Can they do their testing on demand without the use of a scarce integration test environment? And if all those things are true, then they should be able to deploy during normal business hours without negligible downtime, independently of everybody else. And so, I just thought that was just one of the most astonishing findings that come out of the State of DevOps report. So on the next slide, I sort of missed a pattern. A surprising number of the DevOps enterprise community, the people driving it, they actually came from an architecture background. And it's, in some ways, it is the most non-functional, silo-centric groups of the ones that we'll talk about, because I think in general, they are responsible for the entire value stream. And I'll just mention, in fact, let's just go to the next slide. I love this thing that Dr. Stephen Spear, a mentor of mine, talked about. Wait, maybe I didn't put that slide in. He said, you got to see problems as they occur. You got to swarm to solve them, and then you got to share and teach other people. And I think that is often kind of how architects are wired. So, any comments on that, TJ?
No, I think you're spot on, Gene. I think you're kind of summarizing this idea where there's almost like an element of independence, where they see their responsibility and they're able to act in a way that says, I'm going to act responsibly and solve problems. And like you said, and share and teach. To me, that's so critical as part of this. It's not just, hey, I fixed it and let's move on. It's like, how do I make sure I'm empowering the teams to take advantage of these learnings?
Awesome.
Okay. So our next group, the operations folks. How come these people always get the bad name in this conversation, Gene?
That's not intended. Sorry. That's some of my best friends are operations people, so that's not right.
Yeah, of course. I always think, they have a pretty dubious role, right? Their role in life is they have to keep these systems up. They have to make sure that they're managing systems that, are high profile. There's, a lot of eyes on them when there's outages. It's a lot of stress. This is their traffic control for an enterprise organization. And the pattern that we're seeing emerge an awful lot is the idea where if operations is leading this DevOps transformation, a lot of their focus is going to be configuration automation. Everything is code, making sure that people who are delivering changes to these systems are doing so in a very controlled version manner. So that we can deliver more quickly, we can deliver faster, we can deliver during the day. We don't need blackouts, those types of things. Is that where you see operations trending in terms of implementing DevOps?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that we found in the early years of the DevOps Enterprise Summit in 2014, 2015 was that was actually the most common role of people driving DevOps in the enterprise. And here's some of my favorite examples. I mean, let's go back to Key and John Rez. So John Rez is such an interesting case. So he attended DevOps Enterprise in 2015, and by 2016 he was presenting and about how he basically overhauled all of the front end systems for their online banking properties into Kubernetes. He took advantage of a rather serious outage that could never ever happen again to essentially say, this is how we're going to fix it. And again, he's been promoted multiple times since then. And it's just amazing to see how he was really, more than any other group in operations, driving the need to modernize practices within the organization. If we go to the next slide, the other one that really surprises me is from the very beginning is Disney. Jason Cox presented in year one. He's presented every year, and he embeds operations engineers into dev teams, into lines of business to help them take advantage of all these kind of miracles that modern technology allows us, helping them be as productive, as if they were working at a Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, or Google. And one of the things that's always amazed me is that I got to follow him around for a day. This is on the Glendale campus and a couple of years ago. And the day started out at the Starbucks at 8 a.m. We're going through his calendar. He's kind of telling me what to expect. And, a woman, waves at him from across the way and says, thank you, Jason, for saving us a couple of weeks ago. We really, really appreciate it. It turns out that was the CTO of the studios business. And what was amazing is that happened like 4 other times during the day where people would see him across the hallway, across the big room, and say, Jason, thank you so much for saving us a couple of weeks ago. And, so the operations people are now part of the teams. All of them are reporting into, Jason, so they can share practices, very much like the architecture trait that we were talking about before. And they're being integrated into daily operations in a way that, like the daily work of developers, in a way that I've just never seen before. And, again, his team has been growing year over year, and that's taken him to exciting places. And I think that's the pattern, is that there's just a whole different way of working with operations and infrastructure that, I certainly could not imagine 5 years ago. And we see this at Standard Chartered in the banking industry. I think they're almost 300 years old. So much of the work at Target followed this pattern. Adidas created a platform group. So, they're basically creating internal platforms. They're coaching and consulting and onboarding people onto these centralized platforms. They often hold the enterprise site license agreements with external vendors. They have internal expertise to help dev teams. It's just, leads me to believe that the best days of ops and infrastructure are not behind us, but they are definitely ahead of us. It's a great time to be in the game. TJ, does that resonate with what you've seen?
It absolutely does. It's funny. It reminds me of a story. I had a boss a couple of years ago, probably about 4 years ago, and I thought it was such a wise statement at the time. I asked him, I said, who do you think controls the DevOps transformation that we were working through? And he said, it's the person that owns the box. That's the way this works. And it's like you said, we used to think of this as ops was the most common way to implement DevOps because they owned the box, right? They own these systems. But as you highlighted here, these folks aren't all about like, we own it, so we're going to tell you how to do it. These people are like partnering with these, different teams, these different parts of the organization, and making sure that they're enabled to be successful. That's a significant change. And I think you're right. Operations is just becoming more and more relevant as part of this.
Hey, can I just tell you a quick story about why I think this is so important? Um, so, for the majority of my career, I've really self-identified as an ops person. I mean, the Phoenix project was written from the ops perspective, and this is despite having got my graduate degree in compiler design. So I was really trained as a developer. But it was really for almost 2 decades, where I really, what I really loved was the ops side and infrastructure. But I have to admit, that's really changed in the last 3 or 4 years. I spent a lot of time in, I think that, learning the Clojure functional programming language really uh, changed me. And what I've noticed is that I've become very fussy about where I spend my time. And I just don't really want to be, I want to be spending my time in the code, not in the infrastructure.
Hmm.
Um, I don't want to be writing YAML files or bash scripts or dealing with double dollar signs and make files or connecting to databases or dealing with Kubernetes deployment files. I mean, I just like whatever joy I ever got out of those things has basically vanished. And
Yep.
so really what I want is just I would love a friend in operations that could do all these things for me, like what Jason does for Disney. And
Yep.
and I think that's really where we want developers to be. We want them to be focused on solving the business problem and not futzing around with infrastructure. And I think that's great for ops and it's great for dev. So I don't know about you, but I really see this tremendous value that ops and infrastructure specialists have.
Yes, yeah, and I think it's a that's a great story, by the way, Gene, too. About we are deciding where we're spending our time, and one thing it makes me think of is so often here at Xavier Labs, with customer success, with my role, I'm dealing with customers who are doing this. They're implementing, our not only our tools, but implementing this transformation. And so often the question comes, can you help us with best practice? So the days are kind of gone of like, we'll just figure it out, and if it doesn't work, we're going to try it again. These organizations are hungry for, to your point, let's partner. What's the best practice? Like what is the right way to do this? And I think that's a different conversation than we were having about DevOps, in just a few years.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is wonderful to have specialization, and especially and as opposed to developers having to learn everything. Like that's eventually gets not so fun.
Right, right. We all, I mean, we're as developers, we all share files anyways, right? So there's not a lot of new coding, I think, at the end of the day. But cool.
Absolutely.
All right. So keep moving here. The next is cloud teams. And I think this is an interesting one for sure because, I mean, every organization, right, they have a cloud initiative. Everyone is moving to the cloud. That's no secret. One thing that we find here is that a lot of times when we work with customers, they're starting these cloud initiatives with the newer applications, the ones that are, they're not the legacy applications, they're brand new services that they're publishing, these greenfield applications. And I think the primary reason they do that is it's easier, and I say that in quotes, right? It's easier because they have to learn what this cloud platform is all about. Like, how do I run a business now that I'm moving from the legacy data center out onto the cloud? So using almost like these simpler application stacks, not to minimize them, but it's actually a good way for them to learn the best practice and how to do this thing. So, introducing cloud services is an important aspect of this DevOps transformation for cloud teams. Do you tend to see that as part of your, research?
Yeah, for sure. If you go to the next slide, you can see, just how many examples there are of where developers are in flat out rebellion and they just whip out their credit cards and just go directly to the cloud and maybe often with very little consultation with the rest of the organization. And I think the Nike Digital team is probably one of the best examples. They presented, they present it every year, but Ron Forrester and his product management counterpart, Michael Baker. They talked about how the birth of Nike Digital was really kind of a cloud-first initiative, where they were able to break all the rules. And Capital One has talked about how they are cloud-first, and how they went from a 80% outsourced organization to basically 100% insourced these days. So, HMRC, the tax collection agency for the UK, their version of the US Internal Revenue Service. By the way, they were founded in the year 1200. So,
Oh.
one of the most complex IT estates on the planet. They basically redid their tax assessments or their filing process on the app, on a mobile phone, and did it in the cloud, as a way to bypass just a lot of bureaucracy and governance. They didn't bypass governance, but it was a way to sort of escape from the old way of working. I think we should probably acknowledge that there are category of stories where it was actually cloud that basically has forced the rest of the organization, to recognize that critical initiatives are being that cloud enable these very critical initiatives, and really is forcing this new conversation of like, okay, how do we get the involvement from everybody, not just the cloud team.
Exactly. Yeah. How do we support it? How do we make sure we're right? Everybody wants to deliver faster, but how do you do that across multiple cloud platforms, as an example? Those are good conversations that you have to have as part of this.
Maybe just to I say this half jokingly, but I think it's there's some real truth to this. Is that I think these are the teams that are grappling with, okay, how much infrastructure and platform work do we really want to take on? Do we really want to teach every developer how to write Kubernetes configuration deployment YAML files, and do we really want to teach them Amazon CloudFormation things, and teach them how to monitor their cloud costs better? And I think often the answer is like, gosh, it's not as fun as we thought it would be.
Yeah.
And so here's a great opportunity to create a platform team that really is responsible for taking on some more of these responsibilities and liberating developers from having to worry about all of those concerns.
For sure. And I don't know if you hear this as well, but one of the things that we tend to hear from our customers that are in a very regulated environment, where they can't let developers just run any YAML file to, provision infrastructure and those types of things. So that even that concept of like making sure that they're running secure services, that's an important element of this as well. So it's, they don't want the Wild West. They want to enable developers to have the environments they need and the tools that they need to move quickly, but it still has to be controlled in some form, right?
Yeah.
We still have to do this safely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go. We're going to look at route number 5. This is actually, I thought, was a pretty interesting one, because we're seeing this. I think if you would have said this a few years ago, people would have said, why would a release or release management team or a project management team, why would they be concerned with DevOps? Like, what would that mean to them in terms of, why are they going to run a transformation within the organization? And the one feature that comes out very strongly for us is most of the time that we see like these release teams needing something like a DevOps transformation, it's because they're really living in this IT service management world, right? Where they have to enforce the policies of the organization. They have to make sure that their processes and procedures are organized, and that everybody within the delivery pipeline is following these controlled IT services. So these groups actually have a very interesting optic in terms of what the organization needs in order to make sure that it's, checking all the boxes. So is this something, that you've seen experientially as well, where these teams are almost like taking a different route?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, on the next slide, here are examples where, well, actually, let's go maybe talk a little more abstractly than concretely. So on the next slide is that lead slide talk again. And what I thought was really interesting in the early days of DevOps, and let's call it 2009, 2010, is that, well, maybe why was there such a big boundary between Dev and Ops, and why did so many of the stories focus on deployment? And so that was the early days of Chef and Puppet and CF Engine and so forth, and I think it's because that the deployment was the first time and one of the few times that Dev and Ops actually had to work together. And then and it's actually one of the most complex activities, because to actually successfully execute a deployment, you have to um, involve the work of so many different teams. So whether it's environments team, environment configuration, user accounts, mount points, test data, test execution, integration tests, firewall rules, middleware, right? I mean, you name it. We could probably go to the firewall rules, networking, databases. We could get up to over 50 teams that have to get involved for any significant deployment, and so I don't think it's any. So, in that light, right, it's no surprise that it's actually deployment automation, release automation that was really the starting point for so many DevOps initiatives, because that's where the pain was.
Mm.
So on the next slide are, so many examples where, independent of the role, right, there are aspects, I could have colored half of them, where they're really looking at sort of the deploy and release automation as the catalyst of the big problem that had to be solved, and it just created a radically different way of working. And of course, that then spreads out to become far more than just release automation, but elevating all the technical practices. Does that resonate with you?
It does, and I think it was interesting when you were naming the teams. I think as technical people, the teams that you were, kind of calling out, all the different 50 groups that are involved in that, release activity for deployment, isn't it interesting? It's almost easy to forget that release, management, project management, those, like as technical people, it's like, oh, all the non-technical people that are involved with this. But as an example, I used to work for an emergency response organization where we would have to train our end users, our customers, on software changes. So the trainers were most impacted by bug fixes late in the game before delivery. And you're like, all of a sudden you'd have to have a special meeting with the trainers to not only let them know it's being delivered, if we were having failures, et cetera. So having release management and project management teams drive this, I think they give that voice to the other folks in the pipeline, the non-technical people. I hate to say it that way, but everybody else, because they all have their role as part of that complex deployment as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, there's actually one thing I forgot to add to the slide is that, I think so many, when we talk about ancient, powerful orthodoxies, you have to bring up ITIL. And over the years, and by the way, let me just put this out there, right? I mean, ITIL I thought was amazing. There was a clarity of thinking and a precision of operations that I had never seen before. In fact, my first book, the VisualOps Handbook, was actually based on the ITIL framework, and specifically the service support book. So, I think most large complex organizations, the most powerful orthodoxy is the ITIL service management practitioners. And over the years, we've had some of the people who really were the thought leaders who really drove the service management practices, over the last 15 years, also speak at DevOps Enterprise and just show them how, like me, we've had our conversion and really helping bridge the world of, what we know is a better way of working and the service management community, and really trying to give the ammo so that we can help convince the more conservative change managers, release managers, incident managers, right? Just how that it is not something to fear, instead, something to be embraced.
Yeah, and I think bringing up ITIL is incredibly relevant. I was speaking at a conference last year in Florida, and afterwards, a gentleman came up to me and said, TJ, I loved what I'm hearing here. This is really exciting, but how am I supposed to do this? I'm stuck in an ITIL environment. And we kind of had a laugh as we talked about it, because just because it's in an ITIL environment doesn't mean you can't take advantage of this way of thinking about delivering your software, right? It's there's a standardized practice, but it doesn't mean that like, oh great, we get to be the old crusty people, and there's a whole generation of folks that get to do DevOps. So I always think that's an interesting comparison when people say they can't do it because of ITIL.
Right. Hey, by the way, was that at Service Management World in Florida?
What's that?
Was this at Service Management
Yeah.
World?
Yeah.
So, by the way, maybe you saw a guy named Alan Nance speak, and so he was actually the person who brought ITSMF to the United States. So, I mean, just and he's a phenomenal DevOps convert and champion. So it's amazing how ITIL is changing.
That's right. Exactly. Cool. All right. We're cooking right along now. Now we're out Route 6. And this is focusing on the information security folks. So I think, this is part of the conversation where if operations is, looked at sometimes, as a challenge to the organization, I think information security has an interesting view of the world as well. So they're the ones pushing this DevOps transformation. One of the key aspects that we always see out of this is they need things like chain of custody reporting. They need to make sure that we're enforcing security practices, auditing compliance. And what I found in general is that these information security teams, they've made a lot of investments that are supposed to be helping the app delivery teams, adhere to the process and procedures. So they do tend to focus on tooling as well. It just, I would say in general, they tend to almost focus on the security tools. Is this something that you find when you talk to folks who work in information security?
Absolutely. In fact, on the next slide, one of the findings that we came out a couple years ago was the State of DevOps report, 2018 and also 2017. And it showed that because high performers not only did they have great IT performance, better organizational performance, but they also had better security. Because they're integrating information security objectives into every stage of daily work, they're spending 1/2 the amount of time remediating security issues. And it just shows just how transformative DevOps practices are. And so one of my favorite slides of all time came from Dr. Topo Bradapal on the next slide. He he said many years ago, they don't call it DevOps there; they call it DevOpsSec. Some call it Sec DevOps, some call it DevSecOps. But at least security is in the name, and it's just saying that we're not, it's not that we're ignoring security. We are truly integrating the work of security into everybody else's daily work, and I just think it's magnificent that it's not like it's everybody's job, so it's no one's job. No, it's everybody's job because it is everybody's responsibility. So Topo Pal, he's just done, I think, some of the most amazing work really codifying, how do we redo the control objectives and control activities, and we rely less on separation of duty and change approvals and move it into things like peer review, enforcing that we know where our software components are coming from, that that every change is tested and peer reviewed and so forth. And so he calls it, they've created something at Capital One called the top 10 list, which is actually 16 controls, so that's 10 in hexadecimal, and working with the governance communities, putting pressure on external regulators and auditors, really to essentially rethink how we report on security. So just really great stuff.
Yeah, and I think if it's done well, like Capital One, they're a fascinating story to listen to. If you took this slide out of context, you might think like, oh man, the developers are under even more pressure with this thing called DevOpsSec, because now they have all of these different requirements coming down on them, right? They're being pushed from all these different angles. And we talked about it earlier. I think that's why DevOps as a service is becoming so relevant, is a developer is able to make sure that they're conforming to all of these types of requirements from the business, from information security, because the service provides that for them. Like gone are the days where a developer had to have like a sheet of paper hanging up in his cube to tell them like, okay, if I have a hot fix and it's a Wednesday, I got to call this person. The rules are just part of the service. So the developer is still delivering safe code faster, but they're adhering to the things that are most important to the organization.
Absolutely. It's certainly a pattern.
All right, and our last route, it's kind of funny we left this one for last, is IT management. Don't they always get the worst of the, oh boy, the managers are coming down and they want us to do this thing called DevOps. You've actually already spoken to it several times today, right? It's when IT management talks about a DevOps transformation, they're really speaking in terms of this digital transformation. They're saying we have to modernize our organization in order to stay relevant, in order to compete, and this is important. And I think the biggest feature that I tend to see is when it's successful, it means that IT management is supporting the teams as they go through this change. So kind of like your ivory tower example with the architects, it's not a manager swooping into the cube and saying, just make it happen. It's the management teams are directly involved with supporting the teams, getting them training, getting them help when they need to change processes, etc. So do you see this as an area where, the IT management is a key driver for the DevOps transformations?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I kind of keyed in on your digital transformation part, which I think is, this, over last year, Chris O'Malley, the CEO of CompuWare, $1 billion a year company that, as he put it, was in a state of terminal decline, no new releases for, a decade, talked about what it's really like, from the CEO perspective. And it really helped open my eyes to, this fact that everyone at the board of directors, the CEO, they're being bombarded by the McKinseys and the Bains and the Boston Consulting Groups about the need to transform and so forth. And it's become a focus of the DevOps Enterprise Summit to help bridge that need, with what technology leaders are doing, lower in the organization. And I think there are two examples that the DevOps enterprise community has shown that have really risen to that occasion. One of them is that Kaiser Permanente example I talked about before. She spoke last year in Vegas, where she presented with Lee Kwok, and together they are, so Alice Ray is helping Lee Kwok lead a team of, doctors and clinicians and really try to reimagine what healthcare delivery should look like. And so really trying to understand, how can we reimagine what healthcare delivery looks like, and, blazing a trail for, potentially what, not just Kaiser, but also the healthcare industry at large. And I think that is so exciting, right? Because this is a board level initiative, and it does require the best ways of working that technology can offer. On the next slide, I had mentioned the Digital 17 initiative at Key, where they knew that in order to compete with not just other banks, but the other the people encroaching on financial services and fintech, right, that they needed to step up their game. So here's just another example where DevOps is helping the enablement and the achievement of digital transformation objectives. So these are things I find very exciting, because I think it shows kind of where this community needs to go, is that to be savvy enough to be able to connect the dots and really help expand that coalition. Not just within the technology organization, but beyond it.
Sure. No, absolutely. So I think that's a good segue then, as we go through and kind of think about these different groups. Where would you say, Gene, this goes from here? Are there new transformation patterns that you're seeing emerging as part of this? Is there growth within the ones we've been talking about today? Does anything kind of come to mind?
I think the one that we didn't mention was like what to do when there are vast chunks that are outsourced. And there was a very interesting presentation by DXC and Fiat Chrysler Auto Group that was last year. That was actually a very eye-opening for me. But yeah, I think we've covered almost all of the major patterns. And the one that excites me the most is just how so much of we're seeing kind of a merging of business leadership and technology leadership. So I think that bodes very well for this community.
Yeah, the one I think we missed as well when we're talking about large enterprises is when there's competing initiatives. I don't know if you've seen situations, I know I have, where you'll actually have different teams where they say, hey, we're doing this transformation, but they're not talking together. They're not even implementing on the same either scale or range or those types of things. And that can be a challenge, right? It's almost like, okay, who wins in that case, or, where do they go for that leadership? And the reason I call that out is a very popular thing I'm seeing in a lot of large organizations to help solve that problem is the concept of a center of excellence. Almost like a centralized consultative agency, so to speak, that will help across the different parts of the organization.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I love that just because it shows that a vibrant internal marketplace exists, and may the best one win. Right.
Yep. Okay. So it looks like in terms of time, I don't know, Amanda, do we have time for a question? Do you have some? Oh, actually we have. Go ahead, Gene.
Oh, great. Yeah. So if any of this has interested you, you should go to the DevOps Enterprise Summit, where there's we try to find the best stories in the community, to span across every industry vertical. I mean, that's where all this information comes from. So if you enjoyed this, you will absolutely enjoy the DevOps Enterprise Summit. And it's really a conference for technology leaders, by technology leaders. And just personally speaking, there is no 3 days I learned more than at the at these conferences. And I say that as someone who just loves conferences. This is absolutely my favorite one, and it's not just because we put it together, but it's just it's the most concentrated learning experience that I've ever experienced in my life.
And I can tell you, Gene, the feedback that I generally get when I ask people, I'll say, hey, where are you going for learning? Where are you, how are you trying to understand all of this? I get such positive feedback in terms of folks say that the Enterprise Summit is actually relevant to actually bringing back to their organization. So it's not like you're hearing stories about, people have done DevOps, now they can make changes in production every 45 seconds. It's real people telling real stories that they can bring back. So I would agree with you. It's a phenomenal 3 days.
Oh, brilliant. Great to hear that as always. Yeah, we have time for questions, right?
Yes, so thank you both. This was a great presentation. And we have just a few minutes to answer a few questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to insert them into the questions box in your GoToWebinar panel. If we don't get to them today, keep a look on our blog and we might be able to answer some there. So looking at some of the questions, one that came in was, can you explain DevOps roles and onboarding new talent into the DevOps environment?
Oh. Do you want me to start with that?
Sure, go for it.
Well, the one thing I would call out, and my short answer is that DevOps as a service approach is excellent for that very reason, because that's the reality of these large organizations. They're onboarding not only just new application teams, but just new teams in general, whether it's like an outsourced team that they're bringing in, new individuals. So you really want to implement a solution that provides that kind of self-service onboarding process. And again, it just helps the organization respond more quickly, right? The faster I can get a developer working and making changes, the faster we're going to make, better changes across the pipeline. Thoughts there, Gene?
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm a big fan of sort of liberating developers from tools they don't like. But on the other hand, right, it can be taken to an absurd level where every team has picked such radically different technologies that they can't even move between teams without taking a huge productivity hit. And I think that's one of the things that there's this tremendous benefit that comes when there is a shared group of languages and platforms that once you master one, you can use that throughout the organization. And so it's no fun when developer choice can be taken too far, for sure.
Great.
Great. And then as for the next question, and we touched upon this a little bit, but what are some of the top practices to scale DevOps at an enterprise?
What would you say, Gene?
I think we've given some great examples of that, like architecture and platforms. And I think we hinted at it by the kind of seeing the trajectory of these people who have driven DevOps initiatives. They are succeeding in one area, and the value of it is so evident and recognized by everybody that there's this insatiable desire for them to do more of it. And that's why they're being advanced and promoted. And essentially, this is a way of asking them, can you do more of what you're doing to help make a more material impact to the organization? And to me, it's been such an honor and a privilege to help chronicle these journeys, because I think they're doing such amazing things that are worthy of chronicling.
Yeah, and I think providing feedback loops as part of it has to be a key feature of what you're doing in terms of the transformation, because right as technology is changing, processes are changing, etc. People have to have the ability to say, hey, what we were doing a couple months ago when we started isn't working, or there's a better way. So again, a very agile-like approach to this, I think, is a really key feature for success.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. It's the top of the hour. So Gene and TJ, once again, thank you for such a great presentation. And everyone, hope you have a great day.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, TJ.
Yes, thank you, Gene. Thanks, Amanda. Bye-bye.